I am Grant Wacker, and I'm a retired teacher of Christian history at Duke Divinity School. I first want to offer a word of thanks to Anthea Butler for choosing this session among many other possible options I know. Among Anthea's many virtues is her great compassionate heart for the memory of a beloved colleague who has left us far too soon. Today I will offer a very few biographical details about Edith Blumhofer. Then I will introduce our panelists who will offer their reflections. And as time permits, I will offer a few reflections of my own. Edith Blumhofer lost her long battle with pancreatic cancer on March 5, 2020, at the age of 69. Her academic accomplishments were so prodigious, and her personal relationships, both inside and outside the academy, were so extensive it is hard to know where to start. I'll simply say that she received her BA in history from Hunter College in 1971 and PhD in American Religious History from Harvard in 1977. After Harvard, Edith joined the history faculty at Wheaton College and served as director of the influential Institute for the Study of American Evangelicals, which is commonly known as the ISAE. And she served as director of that institute until she retired in 2017. Edith authored 4 major books and edited or co-edited 12 additional ones. The books represented pioneering studies of the history of the Assemblies of God, the life of the Pentecostal evangelist Amy Semple McPherson, the life of the hymn writer Fanny Crosby, and a forthcoming study of the music of the Billy Graham Crusades. Our panelists today all had close relationships with Edith in one way or another. I will introduce them all right now and in alphabetical order of presentation, and then at the end, I'll conclude with a few comments of my own. Amy Collier Artman is on the faculty of religious studies in the Department of Religious Studies at Missouri State University in Springfield, Missouri. She is the author of The Miracle Lady, Catherine Kuhlman, and the Transformation of Charismatic Christianity in America, published by Erdman's. Our second panelist is not able to be with us in presence. This is Peggy Bendroth, but Peggy has sent along her paper, and it will be read by Catherine Long, whom I'll introduce in a moment. Peggy was executive director of the Congregational Library and Archives in Boston until she retired this past year. She edited with Ginny Brereton, Women and 20th Century Protestantism, which was part of a Pew-funded project in partnership with the ISAE. As mentioned, Kathy Long will read Peggy's paper, but Kathy will add some remarks of her own. Kathy is a retired professor of history and chair of the history department at Wheaton College, which was Edith's academic home for most of her career. And Kathy is the author of the prize-winning book, God in the Rainforest, A Tale of Martyrdom and Redemption. Larry Eskridge is retired associate director of the Institute for the Study of Evangelicals, of American Evangelicals at Wheaton College. Excuse the delays here. I'm not accustomed to having to reach for pages. And Larry is the author of another prize-winning book, God's Forever Family, the Jesus People Movement in America. Our final panelist is Mark Hutchinson, who's professor of history and society and dean of business arts and social sciences at Alphacrucis College in Sydney, Australia. Mark is the editor with others of Australasian Pentecostal and Charismatic Movements, Arguments from the Margins. Well, with that, I turn it over to Amy.
Well, thank you so much to you, Grant, and to Anthea and to Caleb for the chance to take a little while and attempt to honor and remember the rich life of Edith Blumhofer. There, as I prepared for this, there were so many good memories that came up. I just, one that came to mind in particular, when I got in touch with Edith and told her that I was going to be coming to Wheaton to spend time at the Billy Graham Center researching Catherine Kuhlman, she immediately kind of went into hospitality mode. And I was just getting to know her at this time. So I didn't fully grasp what was happening. So she immediately said, she said, oh, okay. Well, we'll get you a room at the Harbor House. Well, if anybody, people who know Wheaton know what the Harbor House is. I didn't know anything about Wheaton. I had no idea what the Harbor House was. And so I was like, oh, okay, thank you. That's nice. I appreciate that. Well, oh my gosh, the Harbor House is gorgeous. It's amazing. I was a University of Chicago graduate student. So I come over to do archival research, and this place is beautiful. That I remember, like, it's this guest room, and it's like butter yellow and a bed for days. You just swallowed up in it, and a beautiful little desk to work at. And and by the way, it was also just across the road from the archives, but that paled in comparison to the bed. It's just, and so there's just kind of my first taste of how she would just scoop you up and take such good care of you. And I really appreciate that. Edith was great, and I miss her. Edith Blumhofer was a brass player. When I thought about what I wanted to say about her today, this fact kept coming to mind. Edith played the trumpet. Now, trumpet players are a breed apart. The trumpet is a very unforgiving instrument, and it is a painful instrument. Female trumpet players were not that common when I was in band, and so even less so when Edith must have decided to take up that instrument. Maybe it's because you cannot be a shy trumpet player. You physically can't be a reticent trumpet player. You have to have confidence to play the trumpet. Nothing is worse for a trumpet player than reservations. The words that are used for trumpet sounds are big and fat and round. Those are the kind of sounds. And without having some mental and physical boldness, a trumpet note just ends up being a raspberry, just like a pitiful, squeezed off nothingness. And as I thought about this, I see this in Edith's life as a scholar. In her early work, she challenged the origin story of Pentecostalism, basically challenging its proud declaration that it is this quintessentially American religious tradition in its roots. Not so fast, Edith argued. There are transatlantic influences that played a significant role in establishing the groundwork for the emergence of Pentecostalism in the 20th century. And then how Edith, a Pentecostal woman, became the director of the Institute for the Study of American Evangelicals at Wheaton University. That just has to be a testimony to her trumpet player willingness to go for it. Women who make their way in male-dominated arenas, and especially women who make it into leadership positions, often have to be a bit brassy. You can't be squeamish about emptying your spit valve right alongside the men. So why did Edith, a Brooklynite, come to Wheaton, Illinois to teach? Why did this cradle Pentecostal take up leadership of the Institute for the Study of American Evangelicals? What was a woman doing leading the Society of Pentecostal Studies? What was it about Edith that made her able to tolerate the tensions in these decisions and thrive as a leader, a scholar, and a teacher? Well, I think as a brass player, but also a singer and a lover of hymnody, just a lover of music, Edith was likely comfortable with tension because musicians love tension. Musicians are excited by the energy of being that dissonant note, by providing that discontinuity that postpones that easy resolution to a chord. I wondered if an attraction to the energy in dissonance was part of how Edith was able to be so effective within the tensions of her life. Tensions like becoming a leader in a tradition that didn't affirm her leadership. Because of her insight into the tension-filled life of women in conservative Christian circles, Edith was able to write with skill and sympathy about Sister Amy Semple McPherson. And in the same way, reading Edith's work on Sister Amy helped me understand the complexity of a figure like Catherine Kuhlman. The conversations I was so lucky to have with Edith in her beautiful light-filled office about her insights into Sister Amy's life and ministry really pushed me. It pushed me to seriously consider, and not in a disdainful or dismissive way, but to seriously consider how and why a powerful female leader would choose to stay within the dissonance-filled bounds of conservative Christianity rather than escape that tension by resolving to leave. And my work was made so much better by those conversations. There are so many questions I wish I could talk about with Edith today. Was it a good thing for Pentecostals to become a part of evangelicalism? What was lost when Pentecostals gentrified? Did she still see herself as evangelical given all that's happened in the past 4 years? The back of Edith's now 28-year-old work, Restoring the Faith, says that it is a story of Anglo-Pentecostalism. I want to talk to her. What is that? Does that even exist? Does that even exist? Did it ever exist? As one who was comfortable challenging the narrative of Pentecostal roots, how would Edith now address the question of white supremacy and systemic racism in the story of Pentecostalism? Edith would have helped me, again, to be comfortable in the unresolved tensions of questions like these, and also to be bold, even brassy, in my arguments and answers. Thank you, Edith, and hold me a place in the heavenly trumpet line.
Thank you, Amy. That was wonderful. All right, Kathy, if you would read Peggy's paper, please, and then follow that with your own.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can.
All right. Well, it's a pleasure for me to be here and a double pleasure to be able to represent in some small way Peggy Bendroth. Peggy, I've known Peggy as long as I've known Edith, just about, I think. And it's been a wonderful friendship relationship. So let me just go ahead and launch into her comments. It's an honor to be included in this panel and a disappointment that I can't be with you in person, or as nearly in person as Zoom will allow. Taking time to remember people like Edith Blumhofer, our treasured friend and colleague, is such an essential practice, not least because it gives us all of us an opportunity to understand how indebted we are to each other, how much our own work and careers depend on other people. I would love to be present to hear the rest of you talk about Edith. This panel had me thinking about my friend and Edith's friend, Jenny Brereton, who died suddenly 16 years ago. I thought I knew her pretty well and considered her my best friend. Her children babysat mine. We wrote articles together. We dared each other to read challenging books. And yet, as I listened to other people's tributes, from her family members, her climbing and hiking partners, old friends from kids' playgroups and book clubs, I got to know Jenny better than ever. And of course, missed her all the more. I'm sure something much the same will happen here today. I met Edith in the Add Women and Stir phase of our profession back in the early 1980s, when young women with PhDs were starting to pop up in ASCH meetings and at various conferences and seminars. I believe I even remember the exact moment in the parking lot of a Days Inn, somewhere in the Chicago suburbs. The occasion was a conference at the Billy Graham Center where I was going to give a paper, my first, and the only female on the program. It's no wonder that to this day, I remember Edith's welcoming smile with such clarity. We were the onlys back then, the chocolate chips in the cookie dough batter, a generally welcome addition, but not an essential ingredient. I'm sure that Edith could tell stories from that time in her life, as many of us could, of silly things said, slights and weird exclusions, awkward moments you are left pondering in the wee hours. But I'm pretty sure she would be quick to say that war stories are not the point. Her gift to us and to our profession was a deep, unfeigned graciousness. Edith's kindness and hospitality enjoyed by so many of us and in so many ways, required an inner compass. Trust in something larger than yourself, knowing what you are about and what is important and what is not. The downside of that gracious goodwill is that you end up administering things. Edith did her own work assiduously and well, but a lot of invisible work too. At the ISAE, she wrote the grants, organized the conferences, and edited the volumes that enabled other people's careers, more perhaps than her own. Let's be honest, our profession tends to reward self-centered behavior. Edith did her own, the delusion that, quote, my work is as important to everyone else as it is to me. I thought about Edith while reading a short book by one of my favorite novelists, George Sanders. Congratulations, by the way, was originally a convocation address he gave at Syracuse University, where he teaches. I can look back, said Saunders, and see that I've spent much of my life in a cloud of things that have tended to push being kind to the periphery. Things like anxiety, fear, insecurity, ambition, the mistaken belief that enough accomplishment will rid me of all that anxiety, fear, money, insecurity. My neuroses will disappear. Over the years, I've felt kindness, sure. But first, let me finish this semester, this degree, this book. Let me succeed at this job and afford this house and raise these kids. And then finally, when all is accomplished, I'll get started on the kindness. Except it never all gets accomplished. It's a cycle that can go on and on, well, forever. Though Saunders' remarks were directed at college seniors, I think they work even better as a valedictory for Edith Blumhofer and my own feelings of affection and gratitude for a one-time fellow chocolate chip, a gifted and hardworking and kind scholar and friend. Thank you. Those were Peggy's comments. These are mine. Many people knew Edith Blumhofer as a pioneering scholar of Pentecostalism, an acclaimed writer and editor of numerous books, and as the director of the ISAE, a gifted and tireless researcher. To me, she was all those things, but I knew her best as a teacher, colleague, and friend. During the roughly 15 years we worked together in the Wheaton College History Department. Edith was a popular teacher. One of her most important contributions to the department lay in her willingness to teach a wide range of upper division classes in American history. And this expanded our curriculum markedly. Most of these classes also reflected Edith's favorite periods from U.S. history, from the Gilded Age in the late 19th century through Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the New Deal in the 20th. Usually these were half semester or 8-week seminars with names like Redeeming Urban America, World War I at Home, and Teddy Roosevelt, the election of 1912, the Roaring Twenties. Students described Edith as an engaging, caring, and approachable teacher, and they appreciated both the depth of her knowledge of history and her enthusiasm for the subject. She clearly enjoyed learning about the past, and she encouraged students to do the same. In addition, Edith Blumhofer genuinely liked Wheaton College undergraduates. Now, we assume that we all teach, and so we all like those undergraduates, but Edith really did almost all the time. She liked talking with them. She invited them into her home. She believed in their potential. They were welcome in her office anytime the door was open. The upper division seminars Edith taught developed a following for her among Wheaton students, including many who were not history majors. She was particularly popular among members of the football and baseball teams. Students came to her classes for the reasons already mentioned, but also because after Edith joined the Wheaton College History Department, word got around that the department had acquired its own in-house baker. Edith loved to cook, and she especially loved to bake. She's the only person I've ever met who actually enjoyed getting up at 5 a.m. to bake cookies or banana bread for students in her classes. Not everything she prepared had a significant historical context. The chocolate chip cookie could just be a chocolate chip cookie. Edith still believed, though, that sampling food popular in the past could be a modest but enjoyable way to learn about that past. History majors agreed with her, especially when it came to cookies. She introduced them to a sugary, spicy, molasses-infused cookie that quickly became a department favorite. Sometimes called Teddy Roosevelt's favorite ginger cookies, sometimes Dr. Blumhofer's ginger snaps, these cookies quickly rose in popularity. Edith made literally dozens upon dozens of these cookies for birthday parties, department meetings, graduation parties, and department chapels. In 2015, they became the unofficial cookie of the Wheaton College History Department. Faculty, staff, and students who arrived at the history department without much of a sweet tooth quickly acquired one. This resulted in something akin to sugar withdrawal symptoms in February 2015, when, horror of horrors, the oven in the Blumhofer household stopped working. In an email, Edith wrote, "I feel the need to let my regular consumers know that our oven is broken. When I took Mamie Eisenhower's deep dish apple pie out yesterday, I noticed that the left heating element was glowing red. This morning I was baking bread when the oven died. Our Roosevelt breakfast had to be rescheduled. The repair date is March 18th, so there are a few weeks of enforced Lenten abstinence ahead." Edith Blumhofer was not a worrier or a complainer. Even before her final illness, she had faced a number of health challenges with equanimity and trust in God. The years between 2016 and 2018 were especially trying. I sent an email offering to help in February 2016 after Edith had experienced a painful and severely sprained left ankle. She responded that she had the situation in hand. In July 2016, I received another email from Edith. "In case you haven't heard," she wrote, "I also have a broken ankle, courtesy of a stream crossing adventure in the North Carolina mountains." Then again in September 2017, a year after I had retired and moved to Indiana, we were in contact once again. Edith apologized for not responding more quickly to something I had written. "My broken arm delayed my response. I now have more finger mobility and permission to use my fingers to type as long as I wear my splint." What gave Edith so much determination in such an unassuming way? One of my colleagues in the history department suggested it was because she's undaunted by mundane tasks. She saw needs and met them with no fanfare. That was what people of faith did. I want to end with a comment Edith was in the habit of making as she was concluding an email. "We surely miss having you around here," she would write. And that's the way I feel today. Edith, we surely miss having you around here. Thank you.
Let's see. Here we go. Okay. Thank you, Peggy and Kathy. All right. We turn now to Larry Eskridge.
Thank you. I'd also like to add my thanks to Grant and Anthea for putting this together to remember a influential historian, and more importantly, I think for all of us gathered here, a good colleague and friend over the years. Our marching orders for the session were, given time constraints, not to dwell too much at length upon Edith's roster of influential publications and scholarly accomplishments, but rather to highlight the relationship we had with Edith over the years. I'll honor that request in a bit, but I do want to note a significant dimension of her career and legacy that I believe is underappreciated. Catherine and Peggy have already mentioned this in their comments to an extent, but Edith was, a gifted writer, a discerning historian, a meticulous biographer, but in her role with the Institute for the Study of American Evangelicals, ISAE, at Wheaton College, her remarkable abilities as a planner, organizer, and network/bridge builder came to the fore. At first as a project director, and then for nearly 18 years of the Institute's head, Edith conceived and put together several important projects: evangelical voluntary organizations, revivalism, Pentecostalism, of course, hymnody, missions, and Billy Graham, among others. The academic work produced through these endeavors was prodigious. The ISAE project on American Protestant hymnody alone turned out count them, 4 volumes of essays, series of hymn arrangements, a music CD, and off the top of my head contributed to the publication of at least 3 monographs, including Edith's own excellent biography of Fanny Crosby, Her Heart Can See. That all of this came together was surely fueled by Edith's organizational talents, but none of it could have happened the way it did if not for the fact that Edith seemed to know or know about or was known to, mostly knew though, pert near everybody. Preachers and academics, evangelists, editors, Pentecostals, mainliners, missiologists, and archivists. She seemed to have contacts everywhere. But what was most amazing about that, of those interlocking networks, was that they had come into being without the type of self-promotion that often produces these elaborate social edifices. Glad-handing schmoozer would be the last way that you would describe Edith Blumhofer. This was a network that seemed to have grown up around a quest for knowledge, shared interests, mutual respect, and genuine friendship. It was my pleasure to work with Edith during most of a period that stretched over 26 years. I first met her back in the late summer of 1988. I was fresh off a 3-year stint as a high school teacher and had been brought on board to the ISAE by its first director, Joel Carpenter, my former history prof at Trinity College in Illinois, now Trinity International University. And he wanted me to serve as a 1-year part-time administrator to help cover the shop while Joel was on sabbatical. Throughout the discussion hiring process, he raved about this new project director, Edith Waldvogel Blumhofer, that they had landed to write and oversee a grant from the Lilly Endowment on evangelical voluntary societies. I remember him saying she was really sharp. Harvard PhD. She'd been teaching down at the Assemblies of God Seminary in Springfield, Missouri. They were just so lucky to get her. As I met Edith that first time and listened to her describe her project and then her ongoing research on a history of the Assemblies of God, I quickly surmised that everything Joel had been saying was spot on. Although I'll confess that when I first heard the German surnamed former Assemblies of God seminary professor come out with this incredible Queen's accent, my face might have registered a big look of does not compute. Over the years that followed, there were 2 attributes of Edith's work I particularly admired, which I hoped rubbed off on my own attempts to do history. First was the relentless, dogged manner in which she would pursue information and data, whether it was one of Fanny Crosby's heretofore unknown publishing pseudonyms or finding an elusive birth certificate for George Beverly Shea's grandmother. Edith could chase down some facts. Second was the way in which she approached the people she studied, and this is probably the more important, I think. She was not naive about the foibles or sins in either her subjects or the societies in which they lived. Edith was no friend to the hypocritical, the conniving, the duplicitous, the power hungry. Even so, I always found that Edith managed to imbue her historical writing with a sense of personal grace and charity. She was profoundly aware that she was dealing with imperfect people, with imperfect faith, living in imperfect times. While I'm grateful for Edith's professional influence and accomplishments, these days, when I think back, what often stands out in my memories are the ways that she built up and cared for the people within her wide circle. Seeing the way in which she took a score of student assistants under her wing and drew them into her research and made them enthusiastic and pretty fair history detectives in their own right. Remembering the annual summer sojourn she spent cooking at her family's church camp in upstate New York. Her involvement in her local church, which was varied and deep. The annual semesterly tutoring sessions, helping earnest football and baseball players struggling to complete a decent term paper. The enthusiasm in which she tackled creating courses on the Roosevelts, Al Smith, baseball. I can't remember how many Roosevelt anecdotes I was treated to over the years. And then the absolute delight she took in mapping out meals and break times for ISAE conferences and meetings. I'll always remember our end of the day heading home sort of summation, heading out the door, sort of rundown on what we had going on in terms of events and chores of the coming evening. Our household was pretty busy, but the Blumhofers seemed to be hopping all the time. As she headed out, I recall her often parting with a genial, "See ya." It sort of struck me as a holdover from Edith Waldvogel's earlier childhood days back in Queens. Edith Blumhofer is missed by many of us as a historian, a colleague, and a friend. We'll see you, Edith. Thanks.
And Mark, I believe Mark is coming to us at something like 4:30 in the morning.
Oh,
in Australia. Yeah, okay.
now it's a luxurious 5 a.m. So Edith would have just getting
Okay.
to cook to bake. Yeah.
All right. Look forward to your remarks, Mark. Your memories.
Well, back in about 1990, the ISAE accepted a paper from a totally unknown Australian to a conference in Wheaton. And my first response to my travel agent was to say, I need to go to Wheaton. And her response was, where is that? And my response was, somewhere in the USA. Leave it with me, she said. So that was in the days before the internet. And so she rang back about a week later and she said, I found it. It's somewhere near Chicago. And I tell that story mainly because it demonstrated to me first how little newly minted church PhDs, church history PhDs in Australia in the 1980s actually knew about American evangelicalism. And conversely, that it didn't strike the invitational committee at the ISAE that there were parts of the world where Wheaton College was not a household name. Now, Chicago for me was a place somewhere south of Canada, east of where the movies came from, and its greatest son was Al Capone. I might as well have been going to Lake Wobegon. Indeed, as Grant will remember, there was an ISAE executive retreat somewhere up in Wisconsin where this itinerant Australian found himself utterly out of his depth and amazed at the people who framed Edith's life, people like Mark Knoll and George Marsden and James Bratt and Martin Marty and Grant himself. But I was absolutely delighted to find that people up there actually do speak with Scandinavian accents. In that company, I think people like Dana Robert and Ogbu Kalu and myself represented the rest of the world. And I presume my part today is to reflect on how those of us in the rest of the world saw Edith. We are sufficiently separated by the same language, so to speak, as to make the telescope rather than the microscope our instrument of choice. While the distance of historical experience leaves us often unconscious about ourselves, Australians are very conscious of the genius of American conundrums. America is a country of deep minorities and shallow majorities, and much of its wisdom comes from those places of minority. Edith was like that, a third-generation German Pentecostal female who made her way into the halls of male-dominated evangelical majorities and spoke grace to power without surrendering anything of the ecstasis which fueled her insight. I think those who thought that they were directing her thought she was a sort of one-off, a sort of a permissible exception. What Edith first believed and then discovered and finally demonstrated was that once you step outside the vision of America as the normative city on the hill, she herself represented the front edge of migrant Christian scholars writing from other hills all around the world. Her influence outside the USA was that she showed these others, myself included, what was possible in the scholarship of Pentecostalism. This synthesis became evident in 1979 when I was still a third-year student in distant Sydney. Edith's article on the contribution of Reformed evangelicals to Pentecostalism diversified our understanding of the roots of Pentecostalism, not just in the USA, but through her study of the strongly doctrinal emphasis on the Holy Spirit among non-Wesleyan evangelicals and outside the context of the holiness associations which had received so much attention. The underlying message to her scholarly colleagues was, things are not quite as you think they are. And she followed this in 1981 with a review of Robert Mapes Anderson's Vision of the Disinherited, noting how the emergence of the charismatic movement had provided the spark for greater scholarly interest in Pentecostalism. Scholarship too had its history, its habitus, its guiding biases. Edith knew how Pentecostals would react to Anderson's psychologization of the movement, which was a sort of a triumph of method over actuality. But she still admired its contribution to method. The emergence of the charismatic movement for her, as for leaders of the Pentecostal movement, such as Vincent Synan, was the defining, globalizing, transnationalizing force of the period. She would later help bring such people into the mainstream of scholarship and also help them understand the denominational limitations of their worldviews. Long before the current generation of historians formally blew up the idea that Dennis Bennett was the originator of the modern charismatic movement, Edith had concluded that charismatic Christianity was connected to classical Pentecostalism and had been quietly expanding since at least 1950. Her opinion is now the scholarly consensus. In 1985, Edith's Popular History of the AG USA emerged, performing a key role not just for emerging scholarship outside the AG, but amongst the growing Pentecostal institutions and emerging younger scholars with their transnational connections around the world. For the first time, here was a sympathetic but rigorous model for denominational history by a very capable scholar who also had access to possibly the best collection of written sources in Pentecostalism anywhere in the world. It showed that history from a sympathetic Pentecostal position could be done, but that in the house that every story builds, there are windows out onto the world, that no narrative explains itself completely. For that reason, the next year she addressed the fact that the answers to the growing number of questions about American experiential Christianity did not necessarily lie in the American self-narrative alone. So she turned to comparative studies of Alexander Boddy in the UK and T.B. Barrett and Cecil Polhill through the lens of Norway and Keswick and Wales and the Cambridge Seven, noting that studies of Pentecostalism in other cultures, quote, would enable a more precise definition of a broad and diffuse movement. Hers was no narrow view. Edith landed precisely on the view which David Martin would more famously express a decade later in his study of globalizing forms of evangelicalism and their Pentecostalization. It was, in short, not a specifically American culture in which these networks emerged, but a broader transnational reality. Edith had an instinct and an incipient method which provided the space for younger scholars in world Christianity to consider their own realities as worth exploring. As someone who was engaged at the time in a Commonwealth setting, that is the sort of Anglo world outside the USA, where church historians were really finding it hard to think of anything about evangelicalism beyond 1840, I can tell you that Edith's work was a breath of fresh air for people like me. ISAE's emergence as a global centre for the study of evangelicalism owed much to Edith's finely tuned instincts and, as Larry says, her massive network. She had, for instance, a great ear for the way that ordinary people like Pentecostals amongst us and amongst whom she grew up, how they hear things. She regularly wrote in the less academic mode in Christian magazines such as Christian Century or Christianity Today. And in doing so, she was not afraid to tell the truth. A piece on Jimmy Swaggart elicited telling observations out of his serial moral failures about the impact of globalizing media and the therapeutisation of holiness movements in Western consumer contexts. But for me, restoring the faith was where all the lights went on, not just in terms of the subject, but with regard to the flowing together of personal experience, well-formed historian's intuition, and rigorous method. All of it came together. I knew at the time I could either write yet another book about George Whitfield, bless his cotton socks, or I could take Edith seriously when she expostulated with some frustration to Vincent Synan and in my hearing in the foyer of the Barrows Auditorium that Pentecostalism just is world Christianity. And the rest, for younger scholars like me in the rest of the world, as they say in the classics, was history. That led to 30 years of writing about global Christianity, and it owed much to the subtle and often otherwise uncredited insights of Edith Blumhofer. Not everything. Edith was never one who pretended to totalize her work, as Catherine has nicely said, or to stamp her ego on her narratives. But the subtle inflection, the gentle push, the convergence on a critical and previously undocumented reality, that's how I continue to be thankful that I knew Edith Blumhofer.
Thank you, Mark. Anthea, our incoming president, has a story to tell us.
I have a story. I wasn't going to get on this panel, but when I heard everybody talking about Edith, I wanted to talk about her graciousness to a graduate student. So I came upon Edith's work in two ways. I used to be a member of the Foursquare Gospel Church and Away in Van Nuys, and I came across the book about Amy Semple McPherson that she put out in 1993, Everybody's Sister. And I was so impressed with the book. And I remember my then professor, Mel Robeck, telling me, well, Edith and Grant Wacker are coming for this meeting at Fuller, and it's only open, it's closed, it's only for a few people. And I said, well, Mel, why can't I be involved in this meeting? I really want to be there. And so we asked, I believe you, Grant, and Edith, and you all said yes. And I sat in the back, and I'm going to compare it to this, although you didn't treat me like this. I sat in the back like William Seymour and kind of listened to everything that happened. And it was great for me because I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do next and felt that I wanted to do a PhD. And her graciousness then allowing me as a grad student to come into a Lilly funded meeting that was completely closed with people like you, Grant, and Randy Balmer and all these other people, that ended up being that book, Pentecostal Currents in American Protestantism, was really an important formative moment for me. And I think those are the kinds of ways that Edith made interventions in people's academic lives that really helped them go along the way. And so I wanted to say that because there may have been times where I didn't agree with everything that Edith said, but I think that her graciousness and the ways in which she brought people in were really great. And then another thing about ISAE, I cannot think about anything that has been, more important to me in terms of the work that I do on American evangelicalism than having her head ISAE. I looked forward all of the time to all of the newsletters, all the things that happened. I got a really nice review when my first book came out in there, which I was grateful for. And I think it's that kind of, work that sometimes gets termed women's work. It's really important work that happens to grow the field. And this is why I wanted to do this panel for her. While there have been other people that we should be reading a necrology for who have passed this year, I think it's important to honor a woman whose work did a lot of foundational work in the lives of many people in the society. So thank you for letting me jump in. And I just wanted to say that.
Thank you, Anthea. I would mention that there are several published remembrances of Edith that we also might want to look to. One by David Bratt, her editor at Erdman's, on the Erdman's publishing company blog. Mark Knoll, one of her colleagues at Wheaton College, wrote a memorial in the Wheaton magazine. Tom Hastings at the Overseas Ministries Studies Center wrote a wonderful memorial in the blog also for the OMSC. And then Amy has a wonderful remembrance of Edith in Christianity Today. I know there are others out there. There are just so many people who had to express their feelings. I want to add a few words of my own. Edith possessed a rare gift for bringing the eye of a critically trained historian to her subjects and allowing them to speak for themselves without the distortions of academic historians' armchair categories or second guessing what they surely meant. That, at least, as the first move of analysis. Edith did not craft a word without earning the right to speak by long stretches in dusty archives. Edith was a forceful feminist, less by what she said or wrote explicitly than by the quiet power of how she executed her work and lived her life. Not least of Edith's virtues was that she may have been the most humble, least self-promotional academic in our guild. One gains a fuller sense of all of these gifts from the deeply human texture that marked all of her work. Out of scores of possibilities, I have selected one passage from her forthcoming study of the music of the Billy Graham Crusades. And here I quote from the manuscript. Billy Graham stood by Johnny Cash through the difficult times, and Cash was brutally honest with crusade audiences about his struggles. His vulnerability lent authenticity to Graham's message of redemption. The platform regulars had never strayed far from their parents' God, but Cash knew firsthand the depths of helplessness. Cash was a vivid object lesson of what the Salvation Army described as a trophy of grace. Edith and I met in graduate school exactly 50 years ago this year, and we remained close friends ever after. She was a trophy of grace in my life and in the lives of countless others. I want to add my thanks again to Anthea for arranging for this wonderful session. We have a few minutes by design. All of our participants worked very hard to keep their comments brief. And this is a time for us to call for you to add to your comments, your thoughts in our chat line. And I will read them as they come up and as time permits. From Stephen Wolfgang to all panelists, like many, I am grateful for Edith's graciousness as an unknown graduate student 30 years ago in 1991. I organized a session which was amazingly accepted. I'm continuing with from Steve Wolfgang. I organized a session which was amazingly accepted at the AHA meeting in Chicago, chaired by Ed Harrell, commentary by George Marsden, and papers by Edith and myself. Later, she was instrumental in research that I undertook at the ISAE. She was everything the panelists have said and more. That's lovely, Steve, and so apt. Is there other comments that it's the only one that I'm reading? If there are others who wish to add, that would be wonderful. I'm not terribly adept technologically, to put it mildly. If I am missing something, Caleb, or any other words coming through?
And I'm also looking in the chat, so I may not be seen, but I'm the eternal voice in the background. We've got another comment. Here
we come from, oh, more. I may have to read fast. Josiah Baker. A student from the Assemblies of God, asked for a recommendation to learn about AG history. And I handed her, and I'm sorry, the print's quite small. I, a student from the Assemblies of God, asked for a recommendation to learn about AG history. And I was handed Edith's Restoring the Faith. She stood in disbelief before beaming with pride that a woman was considering the authoritative voice on the Assemblies of God's history. I imagine her story is only one of many in the denomination who have been inspired by Edith. Thank you, Josiah. And from Ray Kibler. I met Edith when she taught a course on women in American Christianity one summer at Fuller Seminary. She impressed me for all the qualities that you and others have said. Do we have more? Oh, we do. Bob Schuster, who is at the Billy Graham Center Archives, a director and a dear friend. Bob adds, one other small stone in the edifice of Edith's accomplishments. When she found a source of documents, she did not only use it herself, she also wanted it to be preserved for others. At least two major collections in the Billy Graham Center Archives came about because of her influence and advocacy. Another example of her love of her profession and her generosity. I would add to that too, all the times that back in the days when we sent letters and then later on attachments, constantly, just little tidbits. And she would say, here's the datum you will like. And I, always, it was something I liked, not necessarily for exactly what I was reading, but for the fact that it was a rare, hard to find document, and she'd found it. And she would share it. Edith was so quick, to share anything that she had found. Anyone else?
That made me think of something too, just real quickly. I wonder too how many people, scholars, students that Edith helped welcome into Wheaton, and also to connect with the Billy Graham Center and the archives there, who, like me, come from outside of evangelicalism and don't exactly know how to navigate that and maybe a little intimidated by that. And just for her to be that wonderful entree point and host to say, look at all of this that is available to you. She certainly did that for me, and I'm sure she did that for other people as well.
Well, she did something else in the way of sharing. Once I was at those archives for it was a 5-week stretch, and it was going to be expensive. And so I was staying at a Red Roof Inn somewhere around there, which was not the most elegant accommodations I've ever been in. And I somehow mentioned to Edith, she said, "Where are you staying?" And I mentioned to Edith, and she kind of grimaced. And she said, "Well, how?" She said, "Edwin and I, our husband, we're going to be back in New York for about a month. Why don't you just come and stay in my house?" And so I did those 3 weeks and cut the
Well, it wasn't
grass.
the Harbor House, but that was nice.
Yeah, well, and I cut the grass, and when I came back, and when she came back, she said, "Well, you didn't need to cut the grass. I just wanted you to stay here." So that was the mark. Do we have anyone else? I think you all noticed some recurring themes here. There was no collaboration among any of our panelists. They saw each other's papers just at the last day or two, but no collaboration. But you notice the recurring themes of boldness, of generosity, of sedulous scholarship, fairness. And I think the one word that just comes to my mind above all is kindness. Just the depth of Edith's kindness. And she's impacted all of our lives, and many of us, including me, loved her dearly. Well, I do see we have one more comment, and I think we do have a little more time, actually. Okay, very, very good. Okay, from David Bratt, her editor at Erdman's. "I like to say that Edith was just your ordinary garden variety, Harvard educated German Pentecostal from Queens." Thank you, David. That's marvelous. Which is just another way of saying there's never been anyone quite like Edith. And one more. Mark, did you have a word there? I saw your hand go up.
Well, I need to say that, of course, there are many great scholars in the United States, and it's a massive field now that the ISAE and people like Mark and others are, and helped by Larry and the great community ISAE to produce this tremendous tradition. But outside of the USA, the name Blumhofer amongst Pentecostal scholars looms extremely large. She's a reference, like many of the founders of the ASCH itself. So there's a sense in which, this event is about the Edith that was, but Edith, for those of us who live in the rest of the world, is a foundation plank in our scholarship, and so the Edith that is and will continue to be through the works that she produced over many years is still a very present reality in our lives. There's a wonderful comment there on the panel too.
Yeah, there's a comment from Heather Curtis there.
Yeah. All right. From Heather. "I met Edith during my time as a doctoral student at Harvard. She had blazed a trail for me there, working with one of my advisors, Bill Hutchinson. From that moment on, Edith would check in with me and always offer encouragement and insight. Over the course of my career, I have benefited from Edith's support and generosity. One of my first publications resulted from my involvement in the ISAE's Hymnody project. One moment stands out particularly. When I was struggling to determine the topic of my second book, and I mentioned to her my interest in the Christian Herald newspaper and its proprietor, Louis Klopsch, she looked straight at me and said, 'Interesting man, Klopsch.' Yes, he certainly was. I would not have written that book if I had not received her help." I see one more comment, and then probably we'll have to quit. We're getting close to our closing time. From Brian Darrell. I met Edith at Wheaton while traveling back to Wisconsin from Central Bible College in Springfield, Missouri, to thank her for work on Assemblies of God history, which was a standard textbook for my undergraduate Assemblies of God history and doctrine class. She was gracious and funny and will be missed greatly this side of heaven. I would add just one more comment to all this. So many things that come to mind is her sense of humor. Now, this has come up here and there to some extent, but one of the tidbits that I love is rehearsed by Amy in her Christianity Today article. Amy tells of the time that she was chatting with Edith about hyphenating her name, but not necessarily Amy's, but Edith's, and hyphenating her name when she got married. And without missing a beat and with only a wry smile, Edith said, well, since my given name was Waldvogel and married name is Blumhofer, this hyphenating just really was not an option for me. And I mean, that is just classic Edith. The understatement, the self-deprecation, and the humility. We've come to the end of our time. Again, thanks to Anthea and to Caleb. And well, you know, more and more messages come through, but I think that we're getting, well, I think we might have a minute for just one more brief one from Ann Wills. Thanks, everyone. Wonderful remembrances of Edith. I am grateful for everything I learned from her about history and life. Ann is a professor at Davidson College. We better wrap it up. And so thank you all. And we'll be seeing you soon. Take care. Bye-bye.
You.